The following program is a presentation of KCTS, Seattle.
Funding for this program was provided in part by a grant from the Washington Commission for the Humanities, a state program of the National Endowment for the Humanities.
I don't know of a single person in life that I've learned more from than from Terry Pettus. So I guess he'll always sort of be very, very high in my estimation of what humanity ought to stand for.
Well, like everyone else, my ideas over a period of years change. But basically, I'm the same person that I've always been.
And now, our top news stories for August 1953. Peace in Korea. After 3 years of bloody fighting, dead or alive, our boys in uniform return home. A tough surprise to American intelligence. The Russians explode a hydrogen bomb. A coup in Iran. With help from the CIA, Shah Mohammad Pahlavi overthrows a government that nationalized British and American oil companies. Budget cuts in Washington, D.C. Congress supports President Eisenhower's demand for reduced federal spending. Prison riots in Washington state. Violence flares at Monroe Penitentiary, leaving 1 dead and millions of dollars in damages. A red trial continues in Seattle. Communist Party press boss Terry Pettus and 6 other Reds stand accused of plotting the violent overthrow of the government.
Today, Terry Pettus is nearly 80. He lives quietly in a houseboat on Seattle's Lake Union. "30 years have come and gone since he was branded subversive, and Pettus is no longer an outcast. Instead, he's become something of a local hero.
We'll fight them right down to the last ditch, and we will win. We will win."
He's the leader of an organization representing Seattle's 450 houseboat families. He's been appointed to city boards and honored by the mayor for his civic contributions. But Terry Pettus hasn't retreated from political controversy. He has seen much, remembered much, and lived with passionate intensity through troubled and turbulent times.
I think had we prevailed, had this progressive movement prevailed, of which the Communist Party was a part, not a whole, was a part, this state would be a better state today.
I met my brother the other day. I gave him my right hand, and just as soon as ever my back was turned, he scandalized my name.
Terry's story begins in Terre Haute, Indiana, where his father was a Protestant minister.
Jesus was always a matter of love. I never heard anything about a vengeful God, because Dad, I believe, was what you call a Christian socialist. Now, the old Deb's Socialist Party in those days was made up of an enormous number of preachers, ministers.
The famous socialist Eugene Debs also lived in Terre Haute. In the Pettus neighborhood, Debs was so popular that when he ran for president, even Terry's Boy Scout troop passed out campaign literature. After high school, Terry became a reporter and moved to Minneapolis, where he met and married Berta Peterson. They would be almost inseparable until her death in 1970. When Terry found a job with the Seattle Star in 1927, he and Berta moved west. Seattle was a boisterous, lively city. Terry and Berta found its people and politics fascinating. They lived with artist Kenneth Callahan and drank confiscated moonshine the police gave reporters. Republicans ran the state then, and Terry, a pragmatist, became a Republican precinct committeeman. But the Republicans were not the only politics in town.
Sunday night was the night to go down to the so-called Free Speech Corner down in Skid Row, you know. And the Wobblies there had their meeting on one corner, and the Salvation Army would be over on the other corner.
Seattle's radical Wobblies lived with memories of the 1919 general strike and a dream of one big union for all workers.
One of the Wobbly speakers there was a guy, always wore a derby hat, and I forget what the hell his name was. But Jesus, he was a beautiful street speaker. Oh my God. He could outspeak a Salvation Army band. Now that took a bit of doing, you know.
But the Wobblies were past their prime, and all unions found rough sailing in the prosperous 20s. Then suddenly, the bubble burst.
I don't want your millions, mister. Your millions, mister. I don't want your diamond ring. Your diamond ring. All I want is the right to live, mister. Oh, give me back my job again.
Well, during the Depression, I was one of the lucky ones. In many ways, I was working on the Tacoma Daily Ledger as a general assignment reporter most of the time. But one of the things that I did have an opportunity to do as a reporter is to cover a lot of the stories about the Depression. There was, to put it bluntly, mass misery. Local governments tried with a few dollars to soup kitchens and that, but it was a drop in the bucket.
Soon there were millions of unemployed. Without public welfare, many starved in the streets. But Terry saw that life wasn't grim for everyone. Pets sometimes dined in restaurants while people ate out of cans. It was a contrast that tore at his conscience.
It made me convinced that this system is horseshit. A society that has continued to be built on the exploitation of other people shall not survive. The only way it survived over the years is the pouring out of blood, is the pouring out of misery. It's the oppression of other people. It's the crushing of other people. That there must be a more humane way for the humankind to live.
With society collapsing all around them, some people sought personal means of escape. But others began to consider collective answers to their common misery. The Unemployed Citizens League mobilized 4 Seattle neighborhoods.
They took care of the question of eviction, sometimes by more or less direct action. If you tried to evict, they put the people back in the house. With the light company, if they shut off light, the jump switch was a very popular little instrument. I don't know if you've seen one, it's a little piece of metal. If they pull the meter off, they'd slam one of those back in and make the connection. The only difference is the electricity wasn't being metered anymore.
Seattle's Hooverville. Here, League members developed a remarkable self-help and barter system, the Republic of the Penniless. What Terry saw in this shanty town convinced him that ordinary people could work cooperatively and run their own lives.
It was a community of the dispossessed. It was a community of people who society had rejected. It was probably the most orderly community or neighborhood in Seattle. It was self-policed, self-governed. But it was a place where people depended upon each other and they built a community.
Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Franklin Roosevelt's words inspired a confidence that may not have been intended, as poorly paid workers began demanding the right to bargain collectively. The streets of America's cities became battlegrounds. Erupting on San Francisco's waterfront, the 1934 longshore strike brought confrontation, death, and violence that paralyzed the entire city.
The opposition, of course, said it was heavily infiltrated by communists, you know, as if workers can't do anything until somebody comes along and tells them, hey, you're starving, or, you know, you're being mistreated.
Scenes of open warfare between strikers, police, and militiamen repeated themselves in Portland, Tacoma, and Seattle. Pay and working conditions were especially poor in the timber camps of the Pacific Northwest. In 1935, timber workers went on strike, demanding union recognition and 50 cents an hour. Tacoma, a mill town, was a focal point. The National Guard was called in to disperse picket lines, and Terry Pettus, then a reporter for a Tacoma paper, found himself in the thick of violent battles.
The thing that I remember most about it from a personal standpoint is that I always succeeded in getting on the wrong side of the lines that were throwing the tear gas for some reason or other. I used to chalk up 6 or 7 tear gas episodes a day. So it was a kind of a gruesome ping pong game of some kind. And, you know, soldiers would be throwing the tear gas to them, and they'd be picking it up and throwing them back. And here it was right in downtown Tacoma, you know, and that gas was going all over. The lumber industry was determined, you know, they'd had a fair amount of success since the war, World War I, when the Wobblies imposed the 8-hour day on them. And they were not about to tolerate another union, but they got one anyway.
Inspired by the gains of striking workers, Pettus became the first reporter in the Pacific Northwest to join the American Newspaper Guild. He organized guild locals on all 3 Tacoma dailies.
And in the spring of '36, we got the first citywide agreement in the United States in Tacoma, which lifted everyone's spirits.
Encouraged, Pettus helped reporters and photographers for the Seattle Post-Intelligencer to form a chapter of the Guild. They wanted union recognition. But William Randolph Hearst, the famous owner of the PI, flatly refused to negotiate. Hearst had crushed strikes in other cities, so when Terry's Guild brothers in Seattle began picketing, he was afraid they were doomed to defeat.
Well, we didn't know that the labor movement of this town was just waiting to take a crack at Hearst. He was everybody's favorite enemy. So that morning, with about 22 Guild people on the picket line, good God, and here everybody else going through. But a few minutes later, here come an army from the waterfront. They were the first. A few minutes later, here come the Teamsters. Beck decided to get on the bandwagon, and boy, they can mobilize too. And people come, the teachers' union from the university, this was August, first part of August, and other people. Well, by mid-morning, that wasn't a picket line. That was just one living mass of humanity around that building.
The shutdown of the Post-Intelligencer sent shockwaves throughout Washington state. Battle lines formed. Hundreds of wealthy women marched on the Capitol in Olympia, demanding that the governor break the strike. To their surprise, they were met by crowds of strike supporters and a governor who thought it best to remain neutral. As the strike dragged on, an angry Hearst threatened to pull the PI out of Seattle. Terry remembers how Mayor Johnny Dorr, elected with labor support, threw Hearst's words back at him.
So he's going to leave Seattle. William Randolph Hearst, and he could drag that out, you know, 1.5 miles, and his paramour, Marion Davies. We don't want them in Seattle. We hope you leave right away, Mr. Hearst. We don't like your kind here, corrupting our city and trying to destroy this great labor movement. Oh, Lordy, Johnny was really something.
If the bus gets in the way, we're gonna roll right over him. We're gonna roll right over him. We're gonna roll right over him. If the bus gets in the way, we're gonna roll right over him. We're gonna roll the Union on. We're gonna roll. We're gonna roll. Gonna roll. We're gonna roll. Gonna roll the Union on. We're gonna roll. We're gonna roll. Gonna roll. We're gonna roll. We're gonna roll.
Labor Day, 1936. With the post-intelligencers still on strike, a unified and confident labor movement, 25,000 marchers strong, filled the streets of Seattle. In November, Hearst surrendered, forced for the first time to recognize a union.
The significant thing to me is this is the last time that the labor movement in Seattle moved as one, showing the power of that. Because these unions, the mass unions that were involved in this, Beck on one side and the waterfront on the other, were already squaring off in an inter-union fight over warehouse. And ours come just at the right time. A year later, less than a year later, these unions were at each other's throats.
Exuberant, Terry Pettus left Seattle in the spring of 1937 for a hero's welcome at the National Guild Convention. On his return, he faced an unpleasant surprise.
At the time when I got back from the convention, my newspaper in June of 1937, the Tacoma Ledger, was discontinued publication.
Terry found his next job in South Bend, Washington, as editor of the Willapa Harbor Pilot. In South Bend, he and Berta led a successful local campaign for public power.
And it was then that we got very active in the Commonwealth Federation and organized a Commonwealth Federation unit in Pacific County.
The Washington Commonwealth Federation was a political coalition formed in 1935 by unions, farm groups, and middle-class socialists. They soon found a wide audience for their radical proposals.
The Washington Commonwealth Federation proposes that the state take over those factories that have been closed and put the people back to work.
Generally in that time, people were beginning to assert that there was a new class of rights, that in addition to the property rights, which are firmly ensconced in the state and federal Constitution, there are human rights, and among those rights are the rights to have a job. And if there are no jobs available, then the right to aid, to help from the government until such time as those jobs are available.
So we went out and got candidates from labor or from farm to run for precinct committeemen in the next election, and filed them, got them, and it cost $1 a piece. We didn't wonder whether they didn't have a dollar, we had a dollar.
Organizing in precinct after precinct, Commonwealth Federation activists believed they could use the Democratic Party to advance their ideas. They met with immediate success. Federation members overwhelmed conservatives at the 1936 State Democratic Convention.
So all of a sudden, in one fell swoop, for God's sake, we controlled the Democratic Party. It was our party. We adopted the program.
When the convention was over, the Washington Democratic Party had endorsed a platform calling for production for use instead of profit, expanded relief, and the nationalization of banks, railroads, energy, and communications. Euphoria soon ran into reality, however. Internal conflicts split the Federation. Rival unions and political factions, radical and liberal, fought for dominance. And though many Commonwealth candidates were elected to office, they were a minority in the state legislature, and only their most moderate reform proposals passed. But a determined Terry Pettus plunged deeper into politics, and as he did, he found that many of the most committed and effective activists he met were members of the Communist Party.
I had then become quite acquainted with a number of communists, including some of the communists in South Bend and Raymond and that area. I also had, by the time made acquaintance of a number of other people who I believed were communists high up in the labor movement during the Guild strike, you know. And actually, some of them talked to me about the party. And the 1938, I remember someone gave me a copy of the program of it. And I had watched people that I thought were communists, dedicated people, hardworking people, and I felt it was something that a person should belong to. Our printer was also a member of the Communist Party, and his wife. We had virtually a cell on that little Willow Harbor pilot.
Early in 1939, Pettus was contacted in South Bend by Hugh DeLacy, who had become a Seattle city councilman and president of the Washington Commonwealth Federation.
He needed an editor. A couple of us went down to see him and talked to him, and of course I was instantly enchanted.
The pay was less than half what he'd been accustomed to, but Pettus readily accepted DeLacy's offer. He and Berta moved to Seattle and began work on the Commonwealth Federation newspaper, the Washington New Dealer.
First and foremost, they were the prime articulators of the policies that we adopted. And second, they were the most earnest supporters that you could ever imagine.
With writers like famous actress Frances Farmer, the New Dealer reached a wide audience and urged its readers to organize against social injustice.
I think the greatest contribution made by us in that movement was that we got people active in public affairs. We helped show people that, look, you can do things. You have something that's invaluable. You have the right to vote. That public business is the business of the public, and that you should participate. That politics is something that you don't do on election day. You work at all the year round. And our organizations in the Washington Commonwealth Federation, I think our greatest contribution, that we made active citizens out of a lot of passive people.
They were the breath of life. It takes a long time to get used to the notion that you haven't got such fights to carry on anymore, or if they're carried on, you're not doing it. It was just the way to live, the way to exist, the way to be a human being, the way to seek peace, the way to seek justice, the way to seek security. You know, every value that social value that a person would have was involved in the struggles we had. We never tired of them. We worked nights, all days, and we never tired of it.
But as the 30s drew to a close, justice, peace, and security seemed like utopian dreams. In Germany, Italy, and Japan, military dictatorships had gained power. Their ideology, fascism, was bitterly anti-communist and filled with dreams of world domination. They turned bullets, bombs, and bayonets on their neighbors. Hoping to avoid war, the Western democracies declared their neutrality and refused aid to the countries under attack. Russia had given aid to ill-fated anti-fascists in Spain, but was militarily weak. Desperate to buy time, Stalin signed a non-aggression pact with the anti-communist Hitler. The Nazi blitzkrieg rolled west.
Many people who I respected very much, idealistic people in the Communist Party, left the Communist Party over it because of the fact that the Soviet Union would make even a non-aggression agreement with this horrible monster we called Hitlerism and Nazism. I disagreed with that.
Despite misgivings about Soviet policies, Terry Pettus still had faith in the world's first socialist experiment. The German army pushed deep into Russia. Terry Pettus and other American communists clamored for American intervention on the side of the Soviets. The Washington Commonwealth Federation was divided, for many members felt America should stay out of the war. Then in December of 1941, Terry Pettus was speaking to a Commonwealth meeting in Tacoma when a man rushed to the podium and handed him a note.
I turned to the audience And I said, this has just come in over the air. I think he told me it was ABC or whatever. The Japanese have bombed Pearl Harbor. And it's hard to describe what happened to that audience. I looked at them, you know, what do you say? You know, what can you say? Some people, there was obviously some people started to cry. There was feelings of incredulity. I remember there was a gasp, you know, what has happened? The Japanese have bombed Pearl Harbor.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special news bulletin. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, by air, President Roosevelt has just announced.
Off we go into the wild blue yonder, climbing high into the sun. Here they come, singing to meet our thunder, and the boys give her the gun.
All of a sudden, unemployment disappeared. Just disappeared. All of a sudden, Boeing was hiring blind people to sort nuts, for Christ's sake. They could do that. There's a saying that, you know, you could get into the Army or you could get a job in war industry if you could hear thunder, see lightning, and eat mush. All of a sudden, the Depression disappeared.
The Commonwealth Federation acted quickly, mobilizing scrap metal drives and support for the war effort. And Terry Pettus, the radical, began to feel like a pillar of society.
It's hard for people I know, I've talked to them, to imagine a war in which everybody was, and virtually everybody supported. A war like myself would go down to the draft board to bitterly protest my classification and demanding that I be drafted, and they didn't do it on account of I was essential to the war industry as the editor of a paper. A few years later, I was being charged with and sentenced to prison for being editor of that paper. The thing that is most remarkable about it is the way that it united people in the main. The terrific unity and a feeling that developed that this was a just war.
During the war years, the new dealer was renamed the New World. Pettus urged the opening of an American front against Hitler and a renewed assault on domestic old